So welcome everybody to our final session, which is a review of the last 3 areas of development that we've been talking about, which are communication, motor, and social development. As a reminder, quickly, the terminology that I will be using is all affirming language and identity first terminology. So I will be using the social model of disability, which centers lived experience rather than the medical deficit framing of neurodivergence. And I will be using identity first language, which takes that neurodivergence as an adjective, an aspect of your personality, rather than a separated pathology of something that needs to be cured. Neurodevelopment is the way our brain develops to work all the different parts together. A neurotype is a person's unique way of thinking, learning, and communicating. And this is determined by the way your brain processes information. Neurotypical is also known as predominant neurotype or PNT. A neurotypical person is someone who thinks and processes information in the ways that society expects them to. A neurodivergent person is somebody who processes information and thinks in a way that society does not expect them to, so alternate to the expectations of society. And neurodiversity is a group of mixed neurotypes, so it's not just one type of neurotype, and it is also not equivalent to neurodivergent. Neurodiversity includes a mix of types. Neurodivergent is very specifically somebody who is not neurotypical. The areas of development that we've talked about through this series of sessions are cognitive, sensory, emotional, communication, motor, and social. Today, I will be reviewing the last 3. There are videos on the Pines YouTube channel if you want to get more detail about any of the other ones. And because there's so much to go through today, I'm going to try to go really quickly. But everything that I'm saying today was said in the more in-depth presentations, so you can go check those out. We're talking about this in reference to the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel Tool, which is a tool that we use to gather the observable evidence of external behavior of a child's internal experience. So the child can't always verbalize or express to us explicitly what it is that they're experiencing inside, but we can try to use their external behavior to try to start asking questions about what are they experiencing and how can we make it better for them. The graphic there by NeuroWild expresses that very, very clearly. I think that there's the roots underneath, which nobody can see the root system. All we can see is how the plant is doing on top. And as a reminder, these are the same areas that are assessed in NDOS assessments in the neurodevelopmental assessment process if you're on the wait list for that. But this tool is not a part of the NDOS process. They're just looking at the same areas of development, but for different reasons. The profile wheel tool should always center the child's voice in whatever capacity is appropriate for that child. They can be involved in working directly with it, or we can just be trying to use kind of more I want to say clandestine, but not clandestine means of trying to get their internal experience, and we can also be looking at their behavior. But this should be a team activity. This shouldn't be somebody does it at home or school does it. It should be something that the entire care circle around that young person does together, because we need to understand the entire experience. And that's why the My World Triangle sits at the center of the tool. It's to remind us that we're looking at strengths and challenges in all parts of a child's life. So getting right into it. So review of communication. How do we express and how do we receive? So the types that go within that are verbal, visual, and vocal language. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And communication allows us to share our experiences, express our needs, imagine things, build relationships, empathize with others, influence others, and understand others. And that's probably the most important one, because communication has some challenges when it comes to neurodivergent and neurotypical communication. Verbal and visual and vocal language requires clarity and specificity. So that means how we're looking, how we're in the intonation that we're using and the words that we're using. When we're wanting to support a young person, we need to be as clear as possible so that there's no misunderstanding. But the listener also has an active role in trying to understand. So if we're communicating with a young person, we have an obligation to do our best to understand what they're saying and to communicate back if we're having difficulty with that. Additionally, as an adult, our responsibility is greater to work to understand from the child's point of view, especially when they're very young. And this is where that profile wheel tool really helps, because we can then be thinking, we can try to use it as a structure to guide the kind of conversation that we're having or the clues that we're looking for. So there are two different ways that children can process language. They can be a gestalt language processor, which is a whole to part, or they can be an analytical language processor, which is part to whole. Very typically, it's analytical language processing that we expect of young people, but both neurotypical and neurodivergent children can be either one of those kinds of language processing. It's not that all neurotypical people are analytical language processors and all neurodivergent people are gestalt. There does tend to be a big crossover with neurodivergent people developing their communication in a more whole to part sort of way, but it can go both ways. So really we need to be informed on what both of those look like so that we can support either one of them, because both types of language processing are equally valid. One is not better than the other. One thing that I wanted to point out here to make that clear about the difference. In a Gestalt language processor, they're learning kind of phrases and then they break those down and build them back up to be able to use them in kind of unique sentences. So you can see there it says the example of the first utterance would be, what sound does it make? Moo. And that's because we as adults will have said to that young person, we'll hold up a cow and say, what sound does it make? Moo. So they're associating that thing with that entire phrase. And that's an example of the kind of difference in the way that language is processed. Whereas an analytical processor would go, well, they're asking me a question and the answer is moo. For a Gestalt language processor, it's the whole thing, and then they break it down and work back up. The spontaneous language in the middle is what we're looking for. So whichever way they process their information, we want to support it so that they can get to that spontaneous language. I already talked about this a little bit, which is the difficulty between communication styles between neurodivergent people and neurotypical people talking to each other. So this can be looked at as like two different operating systems on computers trying to talk to each other. It's very often frustrating and ineffective because they simply don't have the same programming. So the social norms for communication are based in neurotypical understanding of social communication, which means most people expect people to communicate in a neurotypical way. There is frequently misunderstanding, but there is also the added burden on the neurodivergent person to try to make themselves more neurotypical in the way that they communicate, because otherwise they're being described as being obstructive, or they're being rude, or any of those things that we get around communication. And this whole idea of that kind of cross communication difficulty is referred to as the double empathy problem. So what behavior might we observe related to communication? Info dumping with everyone who is near, becoming distressed when directly asked for a response or during conversations, becoming situationally non-speaking in certain situations, responding to a question several hours after it was asked, asking lots of questions to the point where people think that you're kind of questioning their understanding when really what you're trying to do is figure out what information you're supposed to be taking away, speaking too loudly or too softly, preferring to use gestures, speaking through quotes instead of through unique creative language, spending longer or shorter than expected amounts of time responding to instructions. Like all of these things are about how we're processing information, how we're encoding that communication aspect of it, and then how we're expressing it, right? So it's the receptive and the expressive. So what internal experience could be driving this behavior? Well, if we're a Gestalt language processor and not an analytical language processor, we're probably going to speak in quotes because the phrase means something entirely separate to the literal understanding of the words. And so that expression might be related to an emotional experience. And so you say that when you feel a certain way. Um, there could be demands that it could be that the demands of metaphorical language, which is very neurotypical language. Neurotypical language is not actually very explicit or direct. Um, that the demand of that on our cognitive, emotional, and sensory systems is exhausting and it depletes us. And so we go situationally mute, or we remove ourselves from a situation in which we need to be verbally speaking. So we're like maybe texting or something like that instead. Um, the need for asynchronous communication is very important because neurodivergent people generally tend to prefer asynchronous communication because that gives them more time to think about their response and to really express their response in the way that they want to come across, as opposed to being put on the spot and having to just respond when they haven't been able to process all of that sensory and internal, like that interoception stuff that we've talked about before. Like it's a whole thing. So asynchronous tends to be preferred, where neurotypical people tend to prefer synchronous communication, real time, which is rapid and overwhelming and doesn't allow you enough time to process everything. Um, there can be a perceived lack of purpose and value to the neurotypical communication style, like for example, small talk. So it doesn't seem like there's really any value in that, because what are you just doing? Talking about whether or not it's raining? Like, why are we wasting time on that, right? So because there's a different mentality entirely around what communication is for. Um, and the info dumping thing, I want to make sure that I talk about specifically, because that could be excitement at sharing something that you really love with someone who you feel like gets you, and connecting with someone, um, which is a very rare experience for neurodivergent people in a neurotypical world. Um, yeah, so I think I've talked about most of the rest of that. And also rejection sensitive dysphoria. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that right now. So rejection sensitive dysphoria and rejection sensitivity um, are more common in neurodivergent people, and it tends to be because of the difference in their brain structure and their emotional regulation. We talked about in cognitive how neurodivergent brains are hyperconnective, so we don't kind of pare away connections that aren't needed the way neurotypical brains do. So we experience everything more and in like greater detail. And so that means if we have a history of being told that we're wrong, or that we have messed up in some way, which is very common for neurodivergent people because the world expects neurotypical behavior, then you start to encode that as the experience that's going to happen. It starts to become expected rather than a one-off kind of thing. And then you become sensitive to rejection. So it's the cumulative past experience of rejection and failure. That means that in any situation where there's perceived rejection, the trigger response is for survival, and it makes you go into fight, flight, freeze. So the amygdala is activated. Your prefrontal cortex shuts down, which means you can't be rational about things, and you just go immediately into protection mode, survival mode. So people with rejection sensitivity and RSD experience intense emotional responses to rejection, criticism, disapproval, and failure, and anything that they can perceive as rejection, criticism, disapproval, or failure. So they become then proactively defensive to that. And it's important to understand that when we're working with young people, this is not something that it takes decades to build up. You go through enough primary school and nursery um, interactions where you're corrected for not sitting still, or corrected for sounding rude, or for asking too many questions, or like any of that stuff. It builds up pretty quickly. So when we're working with young people, we need to be aware of the fact that their amygdala is probably in control and their prefrontal cortex is not working. And so we need to adapt. As I said, as the adults, it's on us to to be more understanding. We have to adapt how we're leading that situation to help them through so that they can see that it isn't a personal criticism so much as a desire to help. So how can we support social development? With everything that we're going to talk about, the first step is to make sure that we're using neurodiversity affirming practice, that we're centering neurodivergent voices, that we're respecting neurodivergent communication styles, that we're presuming competence and promoting autonomy whenever possible, and that we're looking at it as an individual response, an individual situation that we're dealing with. It's specific to this individual. It doesn't matter what we've done with the other 30 people. We need to see what this individual is doing. And we also, of course, need to make sure that we've asked the young person what it is that they want and what it is that they need. Specifically for communication, we can use strength-focused rather than deficit-correcting support, so that affirming kind of language. We can make sure that there are trusted adults around the young person. We can provide a consistent approach in all areas, which is why this needs to be a team event that we're working on this. And we need to validate their internal experience. We are not telling them how they should communicate. We're finding out how they do communicate and helping them achieve what they want from there. Okay, so we're supporting them to learn how to express themselves in a way that is right for them. And we never want to give any young person the impression that their innate way of being is wrong. Specific support strategies include using literal direct language whenever you can, because as I said, neurotypical language tends to be pretty fluffed up. We want to say what we mean, not the opposite of it. So please walk instead of don't run, because that's kind of unclear. There are a lot of other things you could do than run. So let's ask what we actually want for. We want to, the quick tip I have down there at the bottom is only phrase questions as questions. Because if you say, do you want to put your shoes on? Well, they might say no. And then where are you going to go from that? So we're giving the steps, we're helping with all the other areas that we've talked about in terms of supporting executive function and all of that. The way that we do that is we're very clear and direct and say, please put on your shoes, please put on your coat, right? Like, so we're helping them along that process rather than making it muddied by asking questions when it isn't really a question. Primarily for neurodivergent people, we need to give them the space and the time that they need to respond in a way that is right for them. There are lots of supports that we can use. We can use words up key messages. We can use augmentative and alternative communication tools. Like we have technology that is available to us and all sorts of things. But number one, and it always boils down to this, we meet the young person where they are and we help them achieve what it is that they want to achieve. So key takeaways: communication employs visual, body, vocal, sound, and verbal word language. It doesn't mean by verbal, I just want to make sure I said this. Verbal doesn't mean it has to be spoken, because it can be writing, it can be texting, it can be on our AAC device, whatever. It's just the words that we have to work with. Neurodivergent brains have different communication norms, but does not make them disordered communication. Communication is a two-way street. It's not the responsibility of a neurodivergent person to change their communication style to meet the expectations of others. It goes both ways. We do have to understand the differences in those communication needs in order to be able to address the double empathy problem and to make sure that neurodivergent people are able to express themselves in ways that are appropriate and correct for them. And support should always be affirming of the internal experience. And always that last caveat there, that the wheel is being used to gain perspective on a neurodivergent child's internal experience, not to try to force them to comply with PNT norms. Okay, so on to motor. Motor skills are tasks that require voluntary control over movements of the joints and body segments to achieve a goal. It's defined as motor control is defined as the process of initiating, directing, and grading purposeful voluntary movement. So gross motor skills involve bigger movements like running and jumping, climbing, a jungle gym, all those things. fine motor skills are the smaller movements like handwriting, doing up buttons, and even using our lips and our tongue for eating and drinking and speaking. What we need in order to move is to want to move, to have the strength to move, and to have the knowledge of how to move. The most important of those is motivation, though, because if there's no motivation, it's going to be very hard to make any of the rest of it worth it. So we need motivation, understanding, strength, flexibility, timing. Timing is an important one, balance, and the information from all of our senses. So our motor development is very much tied to our proprioception, our interoception, and our vestibular, as well as our other senses. There are 4 steps of motor skill learning: plan, do, evaluate, repeat. And I'm not going to read through all of those, but the idea here is, how do I set myself up to be able to do this thing that I want to do? How do I then actually do the thing that I want to do? I need to review how it went when I did the thing, make changes, and then repeat that process to start over. Once I've got it all worked out, to build my confidence, do it over and over and over, repetition, for embedding that skill. So observable behavior that can be related to motor skill development, looking confused about where to start, always missing the arm in your jacket, like just not being able to get it in there, not being able to line your body up, like, so not being able to position your body for what it is that you need to do, always bumping into things, duplicating steps. That's all about, how do I get myself ready to do this thing? Or how do I organize myself to be able to do this thing? The doing can be anything related to any of those things that we talked about. So putting too much food in your mouth, or not putting enough food in your mouth, like just teeny tiny bits, choking regularly, having difficulty with modulating your pressure, so slamming glasses down when you're just kind of meaning to set it down, slurring or unclear speech, support needed with toileting past the age where you would think that would be needed, tripping and falling more than would be expected for that age, all those kinds of things about the actual process of getting it done. In our evaluation, what we'd be seeing in terms of challenges would be that every attempt is completely different. So they're not taking in the information from the last time to try to adapt the process, or they're doing the same thing over and over, regardless of how many times it doesn't work. So no discernible improvement in the skill, despite having enough practice with doing it, and being unable to do a mastered task if the environment is different, or if anything has changed. So they can very easily bounce a ball very easily bounce a ball on the floor in the gym hall, but they can't seem to do that at home, on the forecourt. Like if they have a basketball hoop in their driveway, they can't do it there. They can only do it at school. And then with the repetition, if they're getting tired or sore very easily, giving up on a task, being completely exhausted by the school day, or needing to take multiple breaks, and being unable to practice a skill in different situations. So like I said, they can do it at school, but they can't even practice it at home. Like it's just too different. And avoiding sports or physical activities altogether. And then having very poor self-esteem related to any activity involving motor skills. So that could be not wanting to do writing tasks at school, not wanting to do any sort of PE stuff unless it's individual stuff, like not being able to do group stuff in PE because you don't know how to line yourself up with other people, anything like that. So what helps? Number 1, we need to check with our GP for any medical causes of difficulties to rule those out. So like I said, with the speaking and the eating, if you're choking a lot, we have to make sure that your muscles are actually functioning the way they're supposed to be functioning in your throat. We need to make sure that if you're saying that your legs are tired all the time, we need to make sure that there isn't an underlying medical reason for that. Once that's all out of the way and anything like that, then we can go on to putting specific strategies into place. So we can use visual aids. We can do activities that target specific movements or motor skills. We can take the time to walk through it with the young person to do that evaluation more times than you might think, but to evaluate it over and over and over and taking the time to work individually. And we can try to preempt some difficulties by providing more opportunities for rest than we would think might be needed for that typical age, or encouraging managing different variables through practice in different contexts. So like working very deliberately and slowly together. And then, of course, celebrating with the young person when they want to celebrate having achieved a goal that they set for themselves, because then we're validating for them, even if it's a small part of that process. We don't have to wait until they're able to climb the mountain to celebrate them for being able to get their hiking boots on, right? So let's celebrate them along the way. There is this methodology around it for addressing the plan, do, evaluate, repeat. We've got set goals, practice and praise, make sure the environment is what it needs to be, and then adaptations as required. So there's a lot of information there, but basically the idea is, as with communication, we need to be very specific and clear and direct. We need to be selective about what we're working on, what the child needs to work on now. Like I said, if we're working on tying our shoes, the end goal for that young person might be that they want to be able to walk all the Monroes, like to climb all the Monroes. But first they need to be able to get their boots on. So right now, that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on that part. Because it has to be about what that young person wants to do, but it also has to be practical to help them get to that end goal. With practice and praise, we're going to give them repetition where possible. We're going to try to remove it from the intensity of the situation where it actually matters. So try to practice it when it isn't important. So if it's being able to cut up our food, we don't want to do that when they're hungry because there's too much pressure in that situation. Reducing instructions so that it's clear and direct, practicing alongside mirror image, practicing alongside rather than mirror image, because that can be confusing. With the praise specifically, praise is acknowledging the specific thing that we want to validate that they were working on, not being like, oh, well done. We want to say that was an excellent way that you looped the laces there. I think that's going to work really well, right? So we're being very specific with that praise and celebrating. And then for the environment, for that evaluation, this is where we have to say, okay, was the environment too much? Did he have a stable starting base? Was the clothing too itchy or uncomfortable for him to be able to focus on the buttons, right? We need to be looking at that kind of stuff. That's what we're evaluating. And then for our adaptations, I'm going to go into that, how we can change things so that then when we're repeating the practice over and over, it's actually leading to progress rather than to disappointment. But always, always, always support should be affirming of the internal experience. So any adaptations that we're looking at that could be helpful are things like really narrowing down what is the specific goal. Because if the goal is to complete homework, complete a homework assignment for the first time, it doesn't necessarily need to be handwritten. We need to look at what the homework assignment was and say, have I met that goal? What was the objective? How can we complete it in a way that doesn't involve this difficulty for this young person? Can posture be changed to make it easier? Can the whole task be easier by removing some steps? Because maybe that last step that is the hardest part actually doesn't matter. Maybe we're actually done the step before that. Can the equipment be changed to facilitate learning? So can we use wider pens? Can we look for big fat chalk instead of skinny chalk? Any stuff like that. And can the tools that we have be adapted rather than having different equipment altogether? So for pencils, they have grips that you can put on them. Maybe that's all you need in order to get the right positioning of your hand. So it's looking at what we can change in order to make sure that when we're asking the young person to practice that skill, the repeating of the skill, that they are set up for success. So our key takeaways: we need motor skills to be able to direct our body to achieve a task. Gross motor skills use big body movements. Fine motor skills use small, precise ones. There are 4 steps to learning a motor skill: plan, do, evaluate, repeat. Motivation is the most important part of learning a new motor skill. Motor learning is a lifelong process, so it's never too late to learn something new. Um, we can support young people to develop motor skills through using the goals, practice, environment, and adaptation approach. And when we have it all set up correctly, practice, practice, practice. Again, we aren't using this to tell somebody how they should kick a ball or whatever. We're using this to understand the way that they do kick a ball so that we can help them do what they want to do. On to social. I'm flying today. Okay, social development. What contributes to social skill development? Everything. So everything we've discussed until now: cognitive, emotional, sensory, communication, and motor. And importantly, with social development are probably the emotional and the communication aspects of that, because those are the ones that are most directly social facing, if you will, like how we manage our emotions when we're talking to somebody and how we are able to receive and express communication. But of course, interoception always matters. So social skills is generally defined as the ability to interact with other people in a meaningful way. And these skills include communication, empathy, and self-awareness. So what do they allow us to do? Social skills. They allow us to share our experiences, to work toward shared goals, to give and receive physical and emotional care, to achieve goals we set for ourselves, to make personal connections, to resolve conflicts, to make friendships and to maintain friendships, and to live and work with others, right? Which is pretty much sums up the world. So we need to understand how people interact differently in their social needs and their innate social needs in order to be able to live and work with the people around us. Conventional theory says that social skills are learned, not innate, but that doesn't account for the internal experience of being in a social situation, nor does it account for the reality of the double empathy problem. So conventional theory is talking about neurotypical applied skills, not the internal experience of social situations. The presumption in conventional theory is that good or successful social skills equals neurotypical social skills. So previously, lots of social skills work that has been implemented with neurodivergent young people has been around trying to eradicate neurodivergent behavior. It's been about trying to implement what is considered to be good social skills, which is how neurotypical people interact with each other. Social skill development for neurodivergent young people on recognizing one's internal needs, though, not on how to change what they're doing to meet neurotypical social skill expectations. If we measure neurodivergent children by neurotypical social norms, we'll always find them deficient because they cannot and will never be neurotypical. And they don't need to be. What we need to do is to help them understand themselves and help other people to understand that neurodivergent social skills are equally valid. Neurodivergent social skills are often portrayed as non-existent or deficient, and this is not the case. Remember, the objective of social skills is to allow people to connect with other people in meaningful ways. Neurodivergent skills do that. They do it perfectly well. They're very different to neurotypical social norms, but they are real, they are recognizable, and they are reciprocated. There is no one right way to socially interact with other people. The um, the implementation of neurotypical social skills training for neurodivergent people leads to masking. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that because this is very important in terms of social understanding and self-esteem. From very early in life, neurodivergent children internalize society's preference for neurotypical social behavior. We see it everywhere. We know what it is, and we know that we're not doing it and that we can't do it. And so we internalize that and criticize ourselves, become incredibly self-critical. This, in addition to the non-affirming social skills training that very often happens, explicit training, results in neurodivergent children learning to mask. Masking is when a neurodivergent person suppresses their natural, innate way of being and projects an entirely alternate personality or portions of a personality in order to be more acceptable to others, or what they think will be more acceptable to others. Very often, this isn't even a conscious choice. It's a trauma response rooted in the continual implicit and explicit messaging that neurodivergent innate social skills are wrong. So when we're masking, we're shutting down who we are and disconnecting ourselves from who we are in order to be what we think other people want of us. And again, it's a subconscious thing. It doesn't happen actively, certainly not at first. Um, the impact of masking is significant and troubling. It leads to extreme anxiety and stress, to distressed behavior, including meltdowns and shutdowns. So that's where we see when people are saying they just flew off the handle out of nowhere and they went completely crazy and they were flipping tables and stuff. That's distressed behavior resulting in a meltdown. There's stuff that's built up to that. Mental and physical exhaustion leading to burnout, and burnout is no joke. We can talk about that more later if anybody wants to. It leads to identity disconnection and loss of self, low self-esteem, poor mental health, including increased risk of self-harm and suicidality, and being more vulnerable to abuse from others. Because if you're not being who you are and what feels right to you because you want other people to like you, you're not going to question anybody who says that they like you, even if what they want to do is hurt you. We mitigate these outcomes by implementing strategies that are affirming and that prioritize authenticity and that say to a young person, who you are is worthy of dignity and respect. You don't need to change. What external behavior might we observe? So they might choose to sit alone in groups. They might be confused about what people are doing around them and why they're doing it. They might need to control the rules of play. They might find unstructured time really distressing. They might be okay at school, and then as soon as they get home, they have a meltdown or a shutdown. They get inexplicably angry when a social situation doesn't go as expected. Being distressed or panicked at the idea of having to attend a large group event, info dumping on deep interests rather than taking turns in conversations, and wanting to have friends but not seeming to be able to manage to maintain friendships. And what internal experience drives this behavior? All the stuff that we talked about so far. So your capacity can be down because you've had to do a bunch of things you didn't want to do. And so now you're overly sensitive to sensory input, or sound is just too much. Like, so they could just be depleted and they need to be alone. They need to remove themselves from the situation, but it can look like they're self-isolating for like avoiding other people, or that they're being rude and leaving a situation. Um, it can be that they're worried about causing misunderstandings or upsetting people unintentionally. So they're asking lots of questions because they want to try to get it right because they know they get it wrong. Confused as to the purpose of superficial communication, which we talked about before. Like, why are you doing this right now? I don't understand what the purpose is of this. With the info dumping again, if somebody is info dumping with you, they are sharing with you something that is treasured to them. It's an act of trust. And so it may look like they're not willing to engage in conversation, but what they're doing is trying to connect with you. And feeling really out of sync with others and confused about why friendship isn't always the same, why it doesn't follow the path that you think it should. So what are affirming social development strategies? The child's voice has to be the determining factor in implementing any social development strategy. If a young person is not interested in changing an aspect of their life, pressuring them to do that will not help them. So it goes back to that motivation that we've talked about. When a young person is motivated to make changes, then we can use affirming strategies with the aim to help them reach their goals, the goals they have for themselves. So things that we can do to help them: we can be aware of social battery and help them be aware of theirs. We can adjust support to match their current capacity. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm not going to read it all, but mostly we want to meet them where they are and help them achieve their goals, not in a way that we think is the right way to do it, but in a way that is right for them. Very specific strategies that you can use are social stories, the scaffolding technique, and also using the pardon me, social battery, being aware of social battery and helping them to learn how to do that. So, oh, and also respect using the socializing traffic light system. So the social battery, and this can help both you and your young person because we all experience drain by the end of the day. It's just that different things tend to drain us. And if we're pushing all of the time for our young person to be engaging in social groups or things because we think that's what they need, that's going to have an impact on us as well as on them. So we need to know about our battery. We need them to know about their battery, and we can help them regulate. That co-regulation thing that we've talked about all the way through is very important. So um, neurodivergent people need alone time to recharge. That is not in question. That is how most neurodivergent people get over the capacity drain that they experience, is by having time by themselves where they can kind of um, build back up. So even when we enjoy socializing and it's with people that we love and we want to see and spend time with, it drains us because of the demands of it. We still always have to mask to a certain extent. And so there is an impact on that. There's the double empathy problem going on. So it's a lot more work. As I said, our brains are hyperconnective. So we're taking in a lot more sensory stuff all the time. All of this impacts us. So we want to help our young person know what is a green activity, what is a yellow activity, what is a red activity, and how do we manage that throughout the day so that we're not over depleting a young person. And if there's an important thing that you want somebody to do, or if there's an important thing that they want to do, if they are very excited about going to a new teen group or something, you have to make sure that you aren't planning other stuff around that for them, because they're going to need their battery to be at full charge in order to get the most out of that experience. Some other strategies are scaffolding, which consists of the adult or the more experienced peer providing support, like direct support through an activity until the young person is in a place where you can withdraw a little bit to help them build that skill. So we're helping them through what's called the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. We're showing them how to do something and practicing it with them. And then once they start to become a little bit expert at it, then we can withdraw our support in order to help them build confidence in it. So a part of scaffolding is like backward chaining and things like that, where you're doing the last step, if that's the hardest step, and things like that. The traffic light system there is important. So you can use stickers, you can use whatever works for you. If these colors don't work for you, then use different colors. But red usually means that I'm not in a place where I can talk right now, or socialize. Yellow means I'm okay for people I already know, for friends, like safe people. And green means I'm open to talking to anybody. And you change those colors throughout the day, and we respect that. So whatever the color is, we respect it. And the supporting social times at school there talks about providing specific activities during unstructured time, stuff like that. Social stories can be very useful, but it's important that they're used to support a young person to understand what is going to happen, that it's information helpful, and that it's giving them perspective on a situation they're going into, and not that it's being used to control their behavior. That is not what we use a social story for. So there are some specific examples there. I had created a little mini film that was in the social presentation a couple weeks ago. You can see it on the Pines Highland Social Stories page now. You can just go watch it there. But the idea is that we are providing them with information they need to confidently interact with a situation, to explain a situation that might not be immediately understandable. We are not telling them how to behave and what is appropriate and what isn't. That's not what it's for. It's not a behavior management system. Okay, our key takeaways. Social skills are necessary for interacting with other people and building relationships. Neurodivergent social skills are equally valid to neurotypical skills. The medical pathological framing of neurodivergent social skills is harmful. All areas of neurodevelopment play a role in social skills development. Social skill development should be directed by the needs and goals of the young person. Masking is the result of non-affirming social skill strategies and living in a predominant neurotype-centric world. And being aware of your social battery can help you positively engage with social activities. And we are never using this to tell people that their innate way of being is wrong. So, if you have questions or if you need support, you can contact Thriving Families. You can call Just Ask. You can go to the previous videos, and there are loads of resources and links that I have put here. So I've included everything that was in the original presentation so that when you get the email from this week's recording, it will include these again. Loads of activities and resources and where you can go to read up more on things to make sure that you're feeling fully informed about how to support the young people that you're working with.